What news stories mattered most this week in the world of media and advertising? I'm Ella Sagar.
And I'm Jack Benjamin.
We're reporters for The Media Leader, and this week we'll be covering Barb, GB News and Ofcom, again, Netflix upfronts, and much more. Jack, good to be with you today on this rainy day.
It's a very dreary day in London.
So what would you say was the most important news story of the past week in media?
Well, I think one of the most interesting stories the past week is actually one that you reported on. Barb, the UK's TV measurement body, is joining the US Media Rating Council. So that's the US audience measurement auditor. We know that audience measurement continues to be very important for marketers. It comes up at all of our events, basically every single time. And to me, this struck me as a story that was quite interesting because you have international cooperation now going on between the MRC and Barb. I was curious, and you talked to Justin Sampson.
Yeah.
I was curious what the benefit would be for Barb's end, but also then, like, why would the Media Rating Council be interested in that level of cooperation?
Yeah, both of the organisations I learned have been around for a long time. Media Rating Council, more than 60 years. And it initially had a focus on TV and has expanded out into kind of online and radio and other bits like that. And Barb started about 40 years ago. And initially that focused on TV and broadcast, and it has incorporated streamers into that increasingly, Amazon and Netflix and Disney, for instance, being the latest streaming partners in with Barb. And when I was speaking to Justin, he was saying, well, the conversations happened quite quickly, and they have shared kind of international questions and challenges facing the industry. And so on the MRC side, they do a lot of auditing and accreditation. And now as a member, Barb will be sitting in on those accreditation kind of processes and also be able to get more of the data sources up from online platforms that are putting that in for cross-platform measurement, which is a big topic, Project Origin on the horizon and all of those elements. So that was a big focus for Barb. And so they're going to take learning from that. And then for the MRC, they had been long admiring Barb's work with streamers and how they can work with that. So I think the phrase that Justin used was they really have a kind of natural marriage. It's like very much like a shared DNA of what they are trying to work towards. And measurement is always going to be a really important proof point for marketers. It's always the content that people want at our events, for instance, and it just seems like it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. It strikes me as a development that it has occurred because you have these streamers that are maybe US based but are international. That Barb's working a lot with Netflix, Amazon, Disney Plus. Those are companies that are also operating huge businesses in the US, and so it's not. The state of TV is much more globalized, I suppose, today.
And a lot more online as well. Yeah. So that there's that as well. So I think there's a lot of knowledge to be shared and best practice and I think the way that they want to evolve standards going forward together. And that's the thing is when I was speaking to Justin, it's like you can make a standard and then a couple of years later it needs to be changed. So that's something else they're aware of.
Yeah, how fast the pace of change is must be constantly accelerating. Another TV story that caught my eye, and which you also did cover this week, is GB News and Ofcom. So GB News is once again facing Ofcom complaints, this time potentially leading to a sanction, or you suppose you could just call that a fine, right?
There are a few different forms that a sanction could take, actually. Okay. So it could be that there could be a fine. I think that's the first thing that comes to mind. It takes about 60 working days for Ofcom it will kind of carry out this investigation. And but it could also be kind of an issue to not broadcast that show again, or to broadcast a correction, those kinds of measures as well. Okay.
Well, it's not the first time that there's been complaints to Ofcom about GB News. We've talked about this on the podcast. I don't know how many times. What happened specifically this time? I admit I did not watch this broadcast. I'm not like a big GB News watcher, so I haven't seen what the issue is.
Yeah, so there were 547 complaints about this particular program. And this program was the People's Forum with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. And the idea is it's a Q&A with the Prime Minister And the thing with it was that there is a heightened kind of threshold for impartiality, because we are, even if the general election date has not been set, we are in the run up to a general election.
Right.
And so what's important is that there is balance, and that there is, say, for example, if normally on a program where there is a forum of this kind, questions are vetted beforehand to make sure that they're and also there are, like, you know, if you have the leader of one party on one show, you have to make it clear that there's a leader of the opposing party on the next show, or you know, and make that quite clear that you're kind of presenting the questions to both sides. And so that was the kind of crux of the issue, was that it seemed from what Ofcom's statement was saying, that they felt like this was essentially a platform for the Prime Minister to put forth his ideas, and there wasn't a sufficient editorial kind of input on what questions were posed to him by the public or by the panel kind of host as to intervene, and so that there were a few different elements there, that they felt meant that they had to take this sanction route, whereas previously they might have found them in breach of the broadcast code, and then they've been working with them to make sure that to make sure it doesn't happen again. Yeah. Right.
The reaction I saw from, I think it was Andrew Neil, seemed like it was like, well, this isn't necessarily the one to go big on, but you sort of the way that you describe in terms of, well, it's a heightened issue in an election year. Maybe that's,
and I think we might see more of this, and in particular with shows that are hosted by people that have political seats, whether they're MPs or that sort, or clear political kind of allegiances. That's going to become more important as we get closer to an election. And I think there are lots of clear rules around election broadcasting as well. So from what Ray Snoddy wrote for us this week about, was that the fine could be at least £150,000 if it is a fine. Right. And then, or it could be a kind of percentage of revenue as well. So which
isn't great for a business that is they've lost 73 million in the first 2 years. Is that, I think that's the latest figure.
Yeah. So there is a lot to look at in this. But to give, GB News has said that it was not justified, and they would
say that, wouldn't they?
So I think that it's the impartiality rules are very different in the UK compared to in other countries as well. So that's another element to consider.
You know, it's interesting, the statement that they gave, in which you reported. I'll just read this quote. It said, "We are proud to be the people's channel, and we will never stop fighting for the right of everyone in the UK, whatever their political persuasion, to have their perspective heard." It's very taking a victim type of stance. Just reminds me of a lot of more like US broadcasters saying, like, we are protecting your right to speak, and, you know, like, if they attack us, they're coming after you. I mean, it's almost political in its own way.
Completely. And I mean, this is an awkward segue, but into more TV news, to move on from that. At Netflix's upfronts last week, it made a few interesting announcements. So it now has 40 million global monthly active users, and it is expanding its partnership beyond Microsoft. So, Jack, what were your main takeaways from this? You wrote about this. There was a few different elements to pick out.
Yeah, there were. I mean, that 40 million number is actually pretty remarkable. The last time that Netflix had reported a figure was in November, and it had 15 million global monthly active signups. And we've talked in the past about how, what does it mean to be a monthly active user of things? So whatever. But by their own measurement standard, that's a huge increase. It's more than doubling. Well, more than doubling, almost tripling the number of users on the ad tier. So that's definitely good progress for them. In terms of other stuff, in terms of building out the more business end, they've expanded beyond Microsoft. We had reported previously, and I think it was the Wall Street Journal that first came out with a report last summer that the relationship between Microsoft and Netflix just wasn't going particularly well. Microsoft had won essentially a competition to become Netflix's global tech and sales partner. And over time, it was basically the demand for Netflix with ads just wasn't high enough to reach a revenue goal that they had set together. Now that Netflix has more people signed up to the ad tier. I'm sure they could argue that they should have a more expanded suite that, for advertisers to just make it as easy as possible to reach this, increasingly large audience. So to that end, they're expanding the number of programmatic partners that they're working with, that to include Google's Display and Video 360, the ThreadsDeck, and Magnite. And it's also eyeing a launch date by the end of 2025 for its own in-house ad tech platform, which would give advertisers even more tools to buy more directly through them. So lots of developments for Netflix. I mean, I think it's one of those interesting things where Netflix kind of felt the need, it seemed like, to rush into creating this ads tier. And in order to do that, Microsoft was kind of the best first partner that they could find to help make that a reality. And now that they have had more time to develop things, they're starting to broaden the horizon beyond Microsoft and including some in-house capabilities.
Yeah, I think that's always the question when there is an advertising launch or another element that involves tech in a business is, do you build it or do you kind of buy it or partner? And I think maybe advertising it was more complicated, and maybe you need a bit more experience, a bit more time. And Netflix was a different company coming into this than, say, the likes of Disney, who had Hulu previously and had kind of had ads with that. And so that there are a few different nuances there. And I think, Netflix showed up at Advertising Week Europe in a big way with their big installations for Bridgerton and for Squid Game. And so obviously trying to become more present in that advertising marketer world. And I think what you were saying in your article is that this would make Netflix more of a standard media buy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, you go from having an exclusive, like if you want to buy, it's going to be through Microsoft, this relationship. And now you can access Netflix's inventory through all these other DSPs. So
And I think Netflix obviously prides itself on the original content that it makes, but also it's that kind of premium content in a way that I think this is something that I'm seeing a lot more of around conversations around broadcasters and streamers alike, is the kind of the quality content, that kind of nature of content, and that being a badge that they use,
and
as well as
particularly attractive for advertisers.
So quality and also accessible inventory, which is
and I'm sure they can point to we've got 40 million now globally. You know, that's an audience that you can directly reach with advertising, assuming that that number could be audited. Which it can be.
The scale, quality, accessibility, all good things that advertisers want to hear. In other news, there was a bit more at Advertising Week Europe last week that we wanted to talk about. So, Jack, you attended a session on sustainability, and there was recently a concerning survey from the IPA and Ipsos about sustainability and how marketers are feeling about that. Can you tell me a bit more?
Yeah, it was actually really interesting because last year, two of our core tenets of what things that we wanted to focus on include sustainability and talent in the advertising industry. We did a lot of content last year around these things, but oftentimes they don't necessarily talk to each other. And this was actually an instance where sustainability and talent were both having impacts. So the IPA did a survey of IPA agency workers, and it found basically that people are really anxious and demoralized about climate that work in this industry, more so than the average person, more so even than young people. Specifically, like if you work in advertising, I think it was like over 1/3, 37% said they felt demoralized about climate change. It's concerning because it creates an issue of, clearly there are people in this industry that feel like their work is actively harming the climate crisis issue, and or if they have concerns about, let's say we're working with a client that is doing that and we're promoting their products, let's say it's an oil company, that younger people especially don't necessarily feel like they can tell their bosses, that can tell leadership, like, hey, we have some concerns about this, about what our work is doing. Like, so they're one of the takeaways was just that there wasn't really a way for especially like junior and mid-tier staffers to voice those concerns. And I think that was sort of one of the takeaways, was just like there needs to be a bit of a culture change to have more openness about this topic. It shouldn't be like a faux pas.
I think that's really interesting because is trying to balance those two things of like, advertising can be that force for good and change behaviors, like sustainable behaviors and things like that. But there is that consumerism, consumption element as well. And learning your craft, you probably, as you go through your career, you probably work on a mix of lots of different campaigns, maybe ones that you felt like did more good than others.
Yeah, of course.
And so how you square that out and what the industry can do as a whole is a really interesting question that we have to tackle.
There was a particularly good quote then. It's something that I feel like is rarely expressed, but Pauline Robson, who's the managing partner and head of sustainability at Essence Mediacom, she said, I think what we're seeing here is that for a lot of people working in the industry, they have a real tension. Our industry exists to drive growth for our clients, to drive consumption for our clients' goods. When you're holding that reality of what's happening in the climate crisis, it's very difficult to be at that edge. Mm-hmm. So it's something that since I started reporting this industry, have noticed, but I feel like it often isn't voiced. Mm-hmm. I think just voicing like this tension exists, we need to recognize it is an important place to start. Yeah,
completely. As we move on, there were a number of other stories that we won't be able to discuss in as much detail. So Jack, if you don't mind, what else should other people be aware of?
Yeah, no problem. Love to read these out. In streaming news, we have a price for Comcast's new US market streaming bundle, dubbed Stream Saver. It includes its streaming service Peacock Premium, Netflix with ads, and Apple TV Plus, and will cost $15 a month. In online publishing news, IGN Entertainment has acquired Gamer Network in its portfolio of games-based publications, including Eurogamer and Rock Paper Shotgun. Terms of the deal were not publicized, but some redundancies have reportedly been made amid the consolidation. In both audio and publishing news, Bauer Media has opened its new London headquarters, The Lantern. It marks the first time its national radio and magazines brands have been housed under one roof. In social media news, Meta's Threads is testing a ThreadsDeck feature that has journalists excited. I've been able to try it out. It really does make the experience much better for keeping up with live news. Meanwhile, Reddit has struck a partnership with OpenAI to allow the AI company to train its large language models on the platform. And TikTok is testing a 60-minute long video feature in a bid to compete more directly with YouTube.
Thanks, Jack. That's all we have time for. So just a reminder, we are looking to take audience questions for the show. So send us any questions, whether on recent developments in the news or something broader, to news@the-media-leader.com for them to be featured on the show. Until next time, Jack, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again for listening to the Media Leader podcast. If you like what you hear, guess what? You can read our stuff at our website, themedialeader.co.uk, where you can sign up to our daily newsletter in the UK of analysis, opinion and commentary about what's going on in media and advertising. You can also find us on YouTube. We are posting video interviews and clips from our live events. And don't forget to check out our LinkedIn page, which is often a very interesting way to see what people in the industry are saying about our articles and the issues we write about. Anyway, get back to work. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.